Take a breath with me for a second and consider something strange. We like to imagine hell as something dramatic, pit of fire, a punishment waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. But maybe hell begins much earlier than that. Maybe hell begins the moment a person decides reality is too painful to face directly. Maybe it begins with something much smaller, a half-truth, a convenient distortion, a carefully chosen phrase that hides more than it reveals. And at first it can feel merciful. The lie protects you. It buys you time. It shields your image. It softens the blow. It helps you avoid the conversation, the confession, the consequence, and the shame. But then something strange happens. The lie does not remove reality. It only removes you from reality. And now, because the truth still exists, you have to manage the distance between what is real and what you are pretending is real. And you have to remember what you said. You have to protect the image. You have to guard the false structure. You have to live the subtle tremor in the body that comes from being divided against yourself. Welcome back, my fellow stranger, to another episode of Traversing the Strange World. And I'm your host, Isaiah Danbury. And this is another Thursday Journal, Notes from the Strange World. Today we are going to talk about the hell that lies create internally and externally. One of the strangest things about lying is that people usually think of it as a moral issue, when often it's a psychological issue, just as much. Because a lie does not only corrupt your relationship with another person, it corrupts your relationship with reality itself. And reality is not something you can escape without a cost. You can deny it, you can postpone it, you can rename it, you can blur it with clever language, you can soften it with euphemisms, you can bury it beneath busyness, distraction, substance, validation, romance, ambition, ideology, or noise. But reality remains where it is. So the real burden of lying is not just that you said something false. It's that you have now created a split between the world as it is and the world as you are trying to present it. And once that split exists, you have to live inside it. And that's where the suffering begins, because now your nervous system has a job that it was never meant to have. Now part of you has to monitor for the gap. Part of you has to watch. Part of you has to manage impressions, edit details, remember what version of events was told to which person, and keep the false self from collapsing under the weight of the real one. And that is exhausting. This is why lying rarely feels like freedom for very long. At first it feels like relief. It feels like control. It feels like escape. But eventually it becomes administration, maintenance, and damage control. When you lie, you always have to remember what you said. You become the groundskeeper of a reality that does not exist. And that is why I think the connection between truth and peace runs so much deeper than just morality in the narrow sense. Truth is not only the right thing to do, truth is also what allows the self to remain integrated. A truthful person will still suffer. A truthful person will still be rejected. A truthful person may still lose things, grieve things, and face consequences or have to walk through painful conversations. But at least he remains one person. The liar becomes 2, 3, and then 10. There is a private self, the presented self, the justified self, the wounded self, the self that knows, and the self that is trying very hard to not know. And this is where precise speech becomes sacred. Because sometimes the first act of redemption is not grand, it's verbal. Because the more precise the speech, the less room there is for illusion to breed. And illusion always breeds suffering. Robert Wright, in Why Buddhism is True, talks about how suffering is not just caused by outer circumstances, but by the way the mind gets tangled in illusion, craving, aversion, and misconception. And what I appreciate about his more naturalistic reading is that he brings nirvana down from the clouds a bit. He makes it feel less like a far-off mystical abstraction and more like a state of greater freedom from distortion. A state of being less jerked around by the false stories the mind keeps manufacturing. In other words, peace begins when illusion loses some of its grip. Sam Harris, in his essay Lying, he makes the case that honesty is not merely some old-fashioned moral demand handed down to make life harder. Honesty actually simplifies life. It removes the need for all the extra architecture of deception, the remembering, the editing, the strategic omissions, the little manipulations, the image maintenance. And then Jordan Peterson, in his book 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, in his rule, tell the truth, or at least don't lie, and another rule of his, be precise in your speech. That second one matters more than we might realize because a lot of dishonesty survives through vagueness, through euphemism, through strategically blurry language. To name something accurately is to stop feeding it darkness. And that to me is where these three voices start harmonizing. Wright is saying suffering grows in illusion. Harris is saying lies make life heavier and more fractured. Peterson is saying truth and precision are how you stop the rot from spreading. And I think all three are circling the same reality. A human being becomes more peaceful as he becomes more aligned with what is true, and less of that subtle nausea that comes from knowing your words and your soul are no longer on speaking terms. This is where the naturalistic Buddhist angle becomes especially powerful to me. Because if suffering is amplified by illusion, then every lie is not just a moral failure, it is an act of mental self-harm. And now the mind has more falsehood to protect, one more distortion to navigate, and one more fracture to normalize. No wonder people are exhausted. No wonder people feel anxious without knowing why. No wonder so many live in a state of low-grade torment. They are trying to be at peace while remaining estranged from the truth. And that never works. You cannot build serenity on self-deception. You cannot construct well-being out of strategic falsehood. You cannot live in a haze of blurred speech, hidden motives, and inner contradiction, then wonder why your spirit feels smoky and claustrophobic. Of course it does. You are breathing in the fumes of unreality. The hell created by lies is not always dramatic at first. Usually it's domestic, subtle, psychological. It shows up in the texture of a person's life. It looks like needing to keep stories straight, needing to remember what version of yourself was given to which person, needing to manage tone, timing, presentation, and alibis. It looks like never fully relaxing. But the body keeps a score even when the mouth stays polished. A man lies to his wife, and now the home is no longer a home. Lying disintegrates any fabric of trust within any social structure. It destroys a family, it destroys a church, it destroys a community. It disintegrates our trust in institutions. Everything ordinary is now occupied by an invisible second reality. And that is hell. Or take a family system built on lies. Nobody says what actually happened. Nobody names who was cruel. Nobody says who drank too much, who cheated, who enabled, who looked away, who made the child carry burdens that belong to an adult. Everything is managed through euphemism. We all did our best. That's just how he is. Let's not dwell on the past. Why are you always so negative? Can't we just move on? So the lie becomes architectural. It enters the walls, it enters the holiday dinners, it enters who is allowed to speak and who is expected to smile. It enters the nervous system of children who grow up learning that the truth is dangerous, precision is punished, and peace means pretending. And that kind of hell can last for generations, because lies do not merely distort facts, They distort the moral weather. The people most committed to preserving illusion begin to think of themselves as peacekeepers. But it is not peace, it is amnesia. Real peace has oxygen in it. A lie-filled life does not. A lie-filled life feels airless. This is the image I keep returning to. A room with no ventilation. At first the smoke is faint, barely noticeable. Just one avoided truth, one shaded sentence, one private retreat. But over time the room thickens. Lies do not simply sit in the mind as propositions. They make you divided. They make you vigilant. They make you interpret every sound as a possible exposure. They make tenderness harder because tenderness requires presence, and presence is difficult when part of you is always guarding the perimeter. In some ways, getting caught can be the beginning of release. The deeper hell is having to remain the custodian of unreality, having to keep it, to feed it, defend it, and explain it. And slowly, year by year, you watch it turn your own interior life into a place you no longer want to inhabit. That is hell. Not merely guilt, but habitation inside falsehood. Not merely shame, but estrangement. Not merely the fear of consequences, but corrosion of simplicity. Until the soul feels like living in a house with windows nailed shut. So if lying creates a kind of hell, then what does redemption look like? I don't think it always begins with some grand heroic gesture. Very often it begins with the return to reality. A reality so simple it almost feels unimpressive. Just telling the truth. Plainly, directly, without manipulation, without trying to make yourself look slightly better as you say it. Because when a person tells the truth, the false self loosens the grip. The nervous system no longer has to work as hard to maintain incompatible realities. The soul starts spending less energy on concealment and more energy on presence. And the gradual relief that comes when you stop feeding illusion, when you stop multiplying distortions, when you stop adding smoke to the room. A truthful person may still suffer, but the suffering changes. It becomes cleaner. There is a suffering that comes from reality itself: grief, loss, consequence, embarrassment, rejection, mortality, heartbreak. That suffering belongs to the human though. But then there is the extra suffering we create by refusing to face that pain honestly. That is where lies do their work. They take pain, and instead of letting it be pain, they turn it into distortion. Then distortion becomes anxiety. Anxiety becomes fragmentation. Fragmentation becomes alienation. And as soon as a person is not only wounded by life, he is trapped inside the machinery he built to avoid being wounded by life. Truth interrupts that machinery. Truth says stop. Stop editing. Stop protecting. Stop protecting what is false. Stand here, call the thing what it is, and that kind of truth can feel like death to the ego, but it feels like oxygen to the soul, because the soul does not heal through management, it heals through contact. Contact with reality, contact with conscience, contact with the actual shape of things. Peace is not merely a feeling, it is what begins when a person is no longer living in chronic resistance to what is true. To stop falsifying. And little by little, that's how the windows open. And that's how the smoke starts to clear. This is how a person who has been living in the claustrophobia of unreality begins to remember what it feels like to inhabit his own life again. And I think I'm going to close this installment with this quote from Sam Harris. When you give yourself the out of lying, you deny yourself the kinds of collisions with reality that are necessary to improve your life. He also said, imagine the unique type of life that can unravel through always telling the truth. The strong, authentic relationships that it can build. The honest mirror of yourself when it's honest self-talk. And if I'm being entirely honest, there have been times I've taken the path of the coward, and I've hid behind lies. Haven't been totally upfront, but I've also owned up to that. So I say this not from a preachy standpoint, but this is a perspective that I've come to find as wise. From one stranger to another. There is freedom in reality, and I'm going to close with that. Thank you for listening to this installment of the Thursday Journal. Notes from a modern man living in a strange land. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, go ahead and like, follow, save. And if you're listening on YouTube, like and subscribe. Until next time, my fellow stranger, let's keep traversing this strange world. Let's always be honest with others and with ourselves. Let's always be introspective and always be inquisitive. And let's remember to be neighborly, folks. Because we're just kind of cast into this life thing. We don't know a lot about it. So at the end of the day, we're all just strangers in a strange land. Till next time, peace.